Greetings, Benjamin J. from BENZTRAINZ with another in the series. Well, what you're looking at, of course, is a Marx double reduction motor. Now, if you've been following the series, you know last week I got a 595 in the mail, from eBay, of course, and got it for $7.50 or something. And the motor was just absolutely trashed, and somebody had just really butchered this thing. And both of the studs for the brush plate were stripped, which is strange. I don't know why anybody would over tighten them to the point where they strip both sides of it. But anyway, both of the studs were stripped. The plate itself was really bent out of shape and had a crack in it. And I didn't know if it was going to be able to save it or not. But in any case, tonight I worked on it, and I had to do the bypass, as you can see. So I bypassed the E unit. I replaced the brush plate, and I just put a drop of epoxy on the studs, tightened the nuts, tightened the screw on the bottom, let it set until the epoxy cured. Used 5-minute epoxy, of course. And I just got this finished, so I just want to see if it's going to run. And I put a traction tire on it, as you can see. And I've got the motor on the rail, and I'm using an old Lionel, what would you call this? Drawbar. Anyway, I've got it hooked over the axle and on the tender. And I use this, it allows me to test the motor without a body on it or without a shell on it. Anyway, want to see if this is going to run. So I just put this on the rail, turn the power on, and let's see how this is going to run. Like I said, this thing was trashed, majorly trashed, which is why I got the 595 for, I think it was $7.50. All right, let's take this around and see what happens. Now, there's no shell on this, so it has almost no weight at all, just the weight of the motor. All right, it's pulling the entire consist with just the motor itself. So as you see, it is running absolutely perfectly. Now I ran this on the bench, and I wanted to see if it was going to run. So before I went ahead and reassembled it, I wanted to see if it was worth the effort. So I just wanted to run it and just as the motor to see if it would pull a consist. And obviously it will. So it was worth the time it took to replace this, or replace the brush plate and repair it. And this thing was, like I said, this thing was in just absolutely terrible, terrible condition. And it was strictly abuse. Somebody had gotten in there and dinked around with this with no knowledge at all of what they were doing. And I still have no idea why they would over-tighten these two nuts to the point where they stripped the studs. Now, once these studs are stripped, the only way to repair it is to replace the entire right side plate. There is no other way to do it except how I did it, which was a drop of 5-minute epoxy, put the nuts on as tight as I could get them anyway, and then tighten the bottom screw. But like I said, both of these were stripped to the point where the nuts would just spin, and the brush plate was really damaged. So I swapped out the brush plate, as you can see, and did the bypass on the E unit. And this motor is actually running surprisingly well. I ran it on the bench for several minutes, and it ran great. And I just wanted to see if it was worth going ahead and mounting it in a shell and putting it on the shelf, adding it to the collection. I was going to use this strictly for parts, but I really hate tearing apart a motor that has any potential at all for running. And like I said, if there was ever a motor to use for parts, it was this one, because it was just absolutely trashed. And this is a makeshift repair, but it worked. And that's the important thing about it, of course. And it's actually running really, really well. And it's a double reduction motor, as you see. And it's pulling this consist just the motor alone. So it has plenty of power, no doubt. So it was definitely worth the time it took to repair it. Like I said, I really dislike tearing a motor apart. You know, that's the last resort. And if there's a chance of getting them running, I always try to see what I can do to get these things up and running. Is it perfect? No, it isn't. Far from it. I had to bypass the E-unit. I had to epoxy the two nuts in place that hold the brush plate. And of course, I had to replace the brush plate itself. Like I said, it looked almost as if it had been pried. I don't know why anybody would do this to a motor. It just made no sense at all. I can't imagine why anybody would strip these, try to tighten them to the point where you actually strip the brass threads. But it was badly stripped. Both these nuts would just spin. And like I said, there was a crack, and it looked almost like someone had tried to pry this brush plate off. So I replaced the brush plate, did the bypassed the E-unit. Like I said, it's a double reduction motor. So it's definitely worth trying to save. And so far, so good. I don't foresee any problems with this. It's not like I ever have to take this back off again. And in most cases, in fact, 99% of the time, you don't have to remove the brush plate to get the brushes out. You just use a sewing needle, lift the springs off the brush, put it over on the side, and just put a sewing needle down in the slot and pull the brushes out without having to do anything to the brush plate at all. It's really, really simple. It's really quick, and you don't have to remove the brush plate. So anyway, I just got this finished and back on the rail. So I wanted to do a video on it, and it just goes to show, as I always stress, don't overlook the junk. Now, I got that 595. I think it was $7.50. And obviously, the reason they sold it so cheap was because the motor was trashed. And it was strictly abuse, ignorance. Somebody didn't know what they were doing, and I'm not sure what they were trying to do. Obviously, they were trying to get the brush plate off. But I don't know why both sides of this were stripped. And it would take a lot of energy to actually strip both sides to the point where both these nuts just spin. But that's what happened. And then trying to pry the brush plate off. I didn't understand what they were trying to do. Obviously, they didn't understand it either, or they wouldn't have done it. But it's a double reduction motor, and it's in fairly decent shape. It hasn't had a whole lot of runtime. So I did the E-unit bypass, as you can see. And again, to do this bypass, you just cut the wires coming out of the E-unit, cut the power wire going to the E-unit. You run this side of the coil to the brushes. You run power to this side of the coil, and the motor will run forward. It runs forward only, but it runs. That's the important thing about it. So it didn't take long to do this, probably, I don't know, half an hour, if that, something like that. Like I said, I ran it on the bench for, I don't know, probably 10 minutes. It actually runs quite well. But before I went ahead and put it in a shell, I wanted to see if it was worth the effort. And it's pulling, I think there's 12 cars on here, pulling it just with the motor. And like I said, this is an old Lionel drawbar, and I've just got it hooked over the rear axle, as you see, and then bent a hook in this end. And it's a great way to test a motor without having to put it in a shell. So anyway, I just wanted to do a quick video on this. It works. And so again, don't overlook the junk. So I have a new double reduction motor, and I did a swap. I just put a different motor in that 595, and didn't know what I was going to do with this motor. I actually thought I was going to have to use it for parts. But as you can see, it's up and running, and it's actually running quite well, considering the bare motor is pulling 12 cars. So, just want to do a quick video. Like I said, I have no idea what they were trying to do when they worked on this motor, or why they would go to the point of stripping both of those studs that have those nuts on it for the brush plate. It just seemed, I can't fathom why anybody would do that. And yet both of them were stripped, completely stripped. The nuts would just spin. Like I said, the brush plate was virtually destroyed. So I've swapped out the brush plate, put a drop of 5-minute epoxy on the studs, screwed the nuts on until they were as tight as they would go anyway, and just let the epoxy cure, and performed the E-unit bypass, and this motor is up and running. So I'll probably put it in a 400 shell. I've got I don't know, probably 6 400 shells under the bench. So for now, I'll just throw it in a shell, put it up on the shelf, and then the next time a locomotive shows up that needs a motor, this is what I will use. And so I do this quite frequently. But like I said, I try to save every one of these motors I can. Out of the 108 running locomotives, I actually bought 112. So out of those 112, 108 of them are running. 4 of them I have used for parts. That's a pretty good ratio, considering that I'm buying junk, literal junk on eBay. I usually won't spend more than $15 for a locomotive. And I look for the cheapest, worst condition stuff I can find, just like this, basically just for the challenge to see if I can get it running. And in this case, it didn't take a lot. It was just a matter of trying to figure out what they had done to it and why. I still can't fathom why they would strip both of these nuts. And they had to use a wrench to do this. I mean, these things were completely stripped. These nuts would just spin. And then it looked almost as if they had tried to pry the brush plate off with the nut still on it, because the brush plate was really damaged. So I just don't understand why they did any of this. And like I said, obviously the person who did it didn't understand it either, which is why they did it. So like I said, a lot of people, if they can't fix it with a screwdriver, they use a hammer. And I have no idea. I just cannot figure out why anybody would damage this motor the way they did. I just can't figure out what they were trying to do. But in any case, it's up and running. So I wanted to do a quick video on this. Again, don't overlook the junk. This one was in really bad condition. And I thought for sure I was going to have to cannibalize it for parts. And before I did that, I figured I'll put a little bit of time in it, see if I can get it running. And this is the result. It's actually running really, really well. Pulling 12 cars with just the motor itself. So, double reduction motor running really, really well. And the repair wasn't difficult. A few drops of 5-minute epoxy and a new brush plate. And of course, I had to do the bypass on the E-unit. But I just wanted to do a quick video on this. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to drop me an email, BENZTRAINZ@gmail.com. And as always, thank you for watching.